Hi. 2 days ago I was in Africa, and if I'm a little jet lagged, I've been in, since the beginning of the summer, I've been in 12 major cities, given 8 talks, and been in the Sahara Desert yesterday, or the day before yesterday. So that's my excuse if the talk isn't clear. Also, 2 months to the day ago, I was launching on the Colorado River in a 6-person river trip, rowing a boat through the Grand Canyon. And so what I'm about to talk to you about, the Grand Canyon, is very near and dear to my heart. It was my 40th trip. I thought that was pretty good. But the 2 other boatmen and women had a combination of over 600 trips down the Grand Canyon. So I want to talk to you today about uranium mining in the Grand Canyon. First, I want to start with some acknowledgments because there's a lot of people and efforts about what I'm about to tell you, and so I want to acknowledge them. The first would be my graduate students, Jim Fitzgerald. He and I first found high uranium in the Grand Canyon springs, well over drinking water levels, about over 25 years ago. Kim Zukowski was another of my graduate students. You can see her hard at work here. The Grand Canyon Association, the Grand Canyon Trust, the Spring Stewardship Institute, those of you who are unfamiliar with it, out of the Northern Arizona University, they have inventory of tens of thousands of springs, and they do great work. Some of the Park Service personnel, are there any Park Service personnel here? No Park Service personnel. Oh yeah, they're Park Service personnel, okay. And then we have graduate students, many undergrads as well, who have worked on this sort of a project. And then finally, a lot of people, boatmen, boatwomen, some people from USGS, Northern Arizona University, and a lot of other Park Service personnel. So my talk outline, I'm going to speak about the Grand Canyon groundwater issues. I'll go on and I'll then talk about introduction to uranium mining on the Colorado Plateau, and there's a moratorium on new uranium mines being put in the Grand Canyon area. Uranium mining, an orphan uranium mine, which is right on the rim of the Grand Canyon and operated from about 1948 to 1970 and has a legacy of high uranium in the springs down below. Potential for contamination and disruption of springs, and I'm going to center on springs. There's other attributes that uranium mining might affect, but I'm going to concentrate on groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And then the future, what we'll see in the future. This is Vasey's Paradise, by the way, and I'm going to put a lot of pretty pictures in because it's an aesthetic place. So the groundwater issues at the Grand Canyon have to do with spring environments and habitats of many, many animals. And some of the previous speakers referred to that and the importance of these things. Springs are extremely vulnerable, much more than rivers and perennial flows. They're very, very subject to climate change or groundwater exploitation. Also, Native American values, a lot of religious values are associated, particularly in the Grand Canyon, with springs. And so the denigration of the springs might severely impact the future. In addition to that, there's waste disposal on the rim. A lot of people go to the Grand Canyon to look over the side. Occasionally I go to the landfill to see the beauty there. And then wastewater disposal. Of course, there's sewage disposal that a lot of people don't know about up on the rim of the Grand Canyon. That's a place called the Clear Water Overflow up on the surface expression of the Bright Angel Fault, not too far from South Rim Village. And then development up on the rim. The first is housing development. There's plans right now for even more housing development just 10, 15 miles south of the Grand Canyon in the town of Tusayan. This is the first well that went in. It goes down 2,500 feet to the main groundwater system there. But now there are 5, 6 wells at that depth pumping water from the same groundwater system that feeds some of the major springs. And then lastly, and I'm going to center my talk on uranium mining in the Grand Canyon. This is the site of orphan uranium mine, about a mile from the South Rim Village, right on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Here's some miners going down in it. as I said, this used to be a tourist attraction, and when we found high uranium in the springs down below, the Park Service dragged a Geiger counter around the surface visitor attraction and found that the soil was hot. And so they closed it down, put a fence around it, dug up the soil, carted it away, put down geotextiles, knocked down the headworks here. So most people know where the Grand Canyon is. It's in northern Arizona, and if you were to look at the Grand Canyon, then you have the North Rim, which is about 300 meters higher than the South Rim. You have the Kaibab National Forest on the North Rim. You have Havasu Canyon over on the left-hand side there. A Native American tribe lives there, and it's known for its beautiful water, travertine. Over on the right-hand side, I've circled the confluence of the Little Colorado River with the Grand Canyon, and that's a whole nother story. Just briefly, they want to put a tram down to put a restaurant down at the bottom, which is horrendous if you've ever been down there. It's very sacred to all the tribes around there, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Havasupai. They believe that's where human beings came out of the earth. The other development that just came out like 2 weeks ago that would be lovely to talk about is they want to put 2 dams on the Little Colorado River and inundate that and flood that beautiful area. And so that's another issue over there. So this, skipped one. This is the Little Colorado River here. In some seasons it's that beautiful blue color. Other times it's this muddy color. There's Grand Falls on the Little Colorado River. And we'd lose a lot of beautiful places if that occurred. And then there's the town of Tusayan down south below, and I spoke about that already. So in an introduction, then, the Grand Canyon has got about maybe 485 hectares of land. It has a seasonal visitation of pushing 7 million people. The elevation range is from a low of 365 meters to over 2,700 meters, so great range in climates. It has a very interesting hydrogeology history, that's groundwater, and it's not known as a cave park, but one cave alone in the Grand Canyon has over 20 miles of passage, which a lot of people don't know, and it's a World Heritage Site. Whenever I start one of these talks, I'd like to always quote a very famous person who said something about the Grand Canyon and our ethic and aesthetic for it. And specifically, Theodore Roosevelt said, "Leave it as it is. You cannot improve upon it. You can work on it, and man can only, the ages have been to work at it, and man can only mar it." I'd like to also add the fine words of my scoutmaster who said, "Leave your campsite cleaner than you found it." And I think that should be an aesthetic we all have. The site you're seeing there is a place called the Silver Grotto, and it's a little side spring, Shinumo 1 it's called. Those of you who, anybody been there? A couple of you, yeah. If you run real fast around here, this pool, you can run around it without falling in. But you got to run real fast to keep that outward momentum, centrifugal force. So the resource issues for uranium mines include the National Park Service. They are worried about contamination of water, about fractionating wildlife corridors. They view soundscape impacts and cultural properties as important. Over a dozen Native American tribes consider this area sacred, and most all of them oppose uranium mining. And then it's a balancing act between a national energy resource and protecting the natural resources of the Grand Canyon. Just so you know, in July, there's a move in Congress to make this area protected in perpetuity from new uranium minings. It went from the House Natural Resources Committee, and it should go to the floor. Where are uranium resources? The Colorado Plateau is where most of the uranium resources are. In the Grand Canyon area, it's some of the highest quality with the highest percentage of uranium. And so these are the locations of uranium mines. But it's been turbulent in its history, and one of the things that a lot of people have heard about is the Church Rock disaster. A mine in New Mexico, its tailings broke, and in 1979, the water flowed over 80 miles into Arizona to the Navajo Reservation. It's still being protested today. Also, uranium mining around the country is being protested. One of those pictures is actually from Nebraska, where I was testifying before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the whole proceedings was interrupted when people burst in and started shouting and yelling and protesting, and we had to evacuate the room. This is a shot to show that there is impact. It's the Navajo abandoned uranium mine sites, the gamma radiation measurements. And what I want to point out here is the red sites there are where the mines are 10 times above background. The yellow is where the mine site is 2 times above background for uranium. The green sites are where the mine is 2 times, I'm sorry, red is above 10 times, mine is above 2 times and below 10 times. Green is below 2 times, below 2 times the background, and the mine is not gamma scanned for the blue. You can see that there's a lot of potential damage and cancer. If you want to go through this even more, there's a great film, 10-minute film called Too Precious to Mine. It's got some beautiful photography, but it talks about, just briefly about the science, a little bit about the Native American concerns, and also the Coconino County Board of Supervisors' economic impacts. The economy of the region is not driven by uranium mining, it's driven by access to public lands, fishing, hunting, camping, boating. So I'm going to spend a little time going through a historical timeline. It'll take a little bit, but I think you should know what's happened in this area. So in 2006, uranium prices began to rise, and mines that were on hold began to investigate going together. There were thousands and thousands of new claims all over the Grand Canyon area that were posted. A Canadian-owned firm called the White Mesa Mill in Blanding, it drains directly into the Grand Canyon Park, filed some claims. And Canadian-owned company reopened the White Mesa Mill in Blanding. It more or less sends its uranium to South Korea. That's, we send it to France, to South Korea, to a lot of the uranium is, and most of the uranium actually is not used in the United States. Some of it goes to Israel. The U.S. Forest Service began permitting exploratory drilling without requiring an environmental assessment. The Bureau of Land Management allowed uranium mines that were abandoned during the 1980s without any revisions to the environmental assessments that were done for those mines. And so the Kaibab National Forest approved a mineral plan of operations for exploratory drilling on some targets. In 2008, the Coconino County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to avoid uranium development on Grand Canyon National Park watersheds. The Center for Biological Diversity, the Grand Canyon Trust, the Sierra Club, they request that the Kaibab Forest withdraw approval for up to 39 new uranium exploration drilling sites immediately south of Grand Canyon National Park. They cited public opposition and flawed environmental review. A restraining order was granted, and then Raul Grovalda from Arizona, who heads the Natural Resources Committee in Congress, introduced the Canyon Protection Act. Almost through this, the House of Representatives then voted 20-2 in favor. The Natural Resources Committee that withdrew public lands surrounding the Grand Canyon from uranium claims. But under the Bush administration, the Secretary Kemphorn planned to finalize a new rule that eliminated a regulatory provision requiring the BLM to withdraw lands from mining when Congress determines there's an emergency situation. So that was in conflict with the congressional vote. However, the Obama administration took over before that was implemented. Finally then, a British uranium mining company pushed ahead to restart a uranium mine in the Grand Canyon area. And that's when a lot of the work on the Navajo reservation saw cancer incidences and things like that. Salazar ordered a 20-year moratorium. I was testifying before Congress at this time, and now any new uranium mines are banned for 20 years as of 2012. And the U.S. Geological Survey refuted uranium industry misinformation, saying the Grand Canyon withdrawal is about maybe 1.5% of the U.S. total, not 40% as claimed by politicians in Arizona and Utah. And then there's lawsuits going on. Just 4 companies, which are subsidiaries of foreign companies based outside the United States, hold 93% of existing claims. Okay, so the springs are beautiful. They're aesthetically pleasing. I can't spend a lot of time on that, but if you've been in the Grand Canyon, some of these springs it takes 2 days to hike back to. If you're doing sampling and things like that, it's really pretty interesting. And they're hugely important in the Colorado River Basin. It's estimated that over half of the upper Colorado River is fed by base flow, which means groundwater. So it's very, very important. And it gives me an opportunity to show pretty pictures. Okay, so anything that's inside canyons can wash down into the Colorado River. There's a high dilution factor. It might not affect people as much, but wildlife and things like that are a great concern. And if you're a backpacker in the Grand Canyon, you know the importance of springs in the summer. So there's one of my graduate students outstanding in her field. And they're hotspots for biological diversity. As a lot of you know, the springs are crucial. And the location of less than 10% of the species in springs is really known, according to estimates of the Spring Stewardship Institute. The springs, sometimes, this is in the Mojave Desert, they have orders of magnitude 5, 10 orders of magnitude more biological diversity than just 10 meters away up on the side, just because of the arid conditions in the southwest. This is Havasu. It's fed by recharge from an area bigger than the size of Delaware, 2 times the size of the state of Delaware. And these aquifers can be windows to the aquifer, these springs where they issue. You can test the waters, you can track and trace with chemical tracers, you can date groundwater and see how long it's been underground. That's what we lonely hydrologists do, is we date groundwater. Oh, let me just say on that last one, and the protections are limited. ISF, that's the in-stream flow standards that have the Safe Drinking Water Act. Where's the in-stream flow in these springs? Okay, how are they protected? The strongest hammer we have is the, Endangered Species Act, which is being undercut right now. And so it's a little bit worrisome. This is Pumpkin Spring in the Grand Canyon, travertine. The highest arsenic we've ever found in a spring is in the Grand Canyon, is right there. So these springs are very vulnerable, and the reason they're vulnerable is ever so slight changes in the water table can dry them up or diminish them and affect ecological all sorts of ecological effects can occur. In the study of 350 springs, Abe Springer and his student Sinclair found that springs, although they're less than 1/100% of the landscape, they have 44% of taxa, 987 native taxa have been found. So I'm not going to talk about science as much as I want to. The field measurement parameters are very, very interesting. Sampling is fun in the winter. You have to, the snow blows sideways and you have to sleep with your sample bottles in your sleeping bag so they don't freeze. In the summer, you're filtered in acidified water is on your back and you can't drink it, and it's over 110 degrees hiking out. But there are things about groundwater fingerprinting and science and flow modeling. There's a model down below that I'm not going to talk about. Well, I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but you can see that some of the faults go back into the canyon, so water that is in the groundwater system is sort of shunted back into the canyon by some of those maps. So to give you an example of one study we've done, we've looked at 400 and 4,164 sampling events where people actually sampled water in the Grand Canyon. Every sample we could get. We've got a few more lately under the Freedom of Information Act, so this is just a little bit old. But I'll give you one example. This entailed over 75 springs. It had some well-watered surface water. We looked for the drinking water standards being exceeded, and what we found is that most sampling events were before the year 2000. And for arsenic then, we found that, the arsenic, 87% of the time it wasn't even sampled. When it was sampled, 11% of the time or so it was not detected, but 88% of the time they found some arsenic. And of those times they found arsenic, over half the time the drinking water standards were exceeded. And this is natural background groundwater. The point here is we don't know a lot about what's happening in the Grand Canyon and other places and other springs. We don't do adequate monitoring for a lot of things. And so if you've been in the Grand Canyon, these are some of the springs here, including Elves Chasm. There's in the background there. Lastly, uranium here. 25 years ago, we found high uranium in the spring in Horn Creek below Canyon Uranium Mine. A little bit about how the Canyon Uranium Mine is formed. I may go over my time just a little bit, but I'll try and stay in it. The main aquifer is the Red Wall Moab aquifer. It's underlain by shale, which holds it up sort of like a dinner plate. But there's also a perched aquifer up above it in the Coconino Sandstone. It's called a C aquifer. There's the Coconino Sandstone in white with a Hermit Shale underneath, holding it up like a dinner plate. And one of the, where the uranium mines operate, in geologic history, you have a cave in the limestone that collapses, and it's called a breccia pipe. Water moves vertically up and down there, and it has a little bit of uranium in it. When it hits a low oxygen area, it precipitates into solid uranium instead of being in a dissolved form. And so that's in the Hermit Shale, which is in brown here. There's a breccia pipe over there. And so that's where the uranium mines are going for. They're going for that. And there are some existing grandfathered in uranium mines, about 5 of them that are allowed to operate, but they haven't operated too much because of low uranium prices. Well, let's look at that for a second. Here's the Hermit Shale and a perched water table on top of that, and the Red Wall Moab aquifer. You put a shaft through that, what's going to happen is you're going to have cascading water that moves vertically up and down. This is uranium-laden water, and it has a tendency to pollute, okay? Importantly, it follows fractures and cracks on down. I won't say much about fingerprinting, but you can look at the 234, 238 uranium isotope ratio, and you can figure out where it comes from. The one that's circled down there is the spring that's below Orphan Uranium Mine. The rest you can see are different. There's tritium on the x-axis, which is an indicator of groundwater age. And so you can see that there's one that sits out there at activity ratio of 234, 238 uranium at 1. We call it secular equilibrium. It's an indication that it's from a uranium mine. I'm going to skip this one here. Dye tracer tests. Here's some dye tracer tests on the North Rim. Karst, which is limestone, is really weird. The Park Service, Ben Tobin, did these. And the thing you can see about this is it goes in all sorts of weird directions. The dye was put in here. Instead of going to the Grand Canyon here very often, it went there and there. If you notice these two here, there's one that was put in there that went this way. There was one that was put in there that went that way. It's really hard to know. The last thing I want to say about the uranium mining here is in 1992 I argued before the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality that the perched aquifer might be a problem. These were test borings in Canyon Uranium Mine, which is about 13 miles south of the Grand Canyon. You can see there's water in them. And so I said the perched aquifer, it might leak. Well, what happened was in 2 years ago, they hit a gusher. A little less than 2 years ago, they hit a big gusher, and Now, well, first of all, so much water was coming out that their surface impoundment couldn't hold it. They were shooting it into the atmosphere, to a uranium-laden water, into the atmosphere to help it evaporate so it wouldn't flood. Now it's down to only 19 gallons per minute, which doesn't sound like much, but that it comes down to about 10 million gallons a year of water that's lost from the perch aquifer. What springs is that drying up? How's that affecting ecosystems? Nobody knows. So going to skip this one. So why are springs in arid lands important? To ensure sustained recreational uses and make sure people don't die in the backcountry. They're an indicator of spring health and ecosystem impact. And then finally, they're Native American religious cultural traditions and historical importance. If somebody was burning down the churches of your particular religion, if you have a religion, no matter where they were, you'd be a little bit upset, okay? Now, these are sacred areas to the Native Americans. So, will the future be placid in this issue, or will it be rough? This is 1983. My guess, it's actually me rowing that raft. For those of you who know the Grand Canyon, this is Upset Rapid. I think the political situation for uranium mining in the Grand Canyon is going to continue to be turbulent, and we'll have all sorts of interesting things as lawsuits abound to have more uranium mining, less uranium mining, and the bill goes through Congress. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And
we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
If there are no questions, I can say 1 or 2 things more. Well, a lot of the federal agencies do a lot of things really well. I was remarking that the Forest Service ecosystem assessment that was presented by Katie, it's some of the best in the world. I've written chapters on groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and there's some things that they do marvelously. What they don't do too well is when they do EISs and groundwater. Oops, I'm sorry, this is another place, and it's, let me just take this off. If you want to see more Grand Canyon River running pictures, so I can throw those in, but my time is out. For example, when you put in a monitoring well, if you have a big screen with lots of places for water to come in, if you have a really contaminated section, fresh water can come in at different areas and make it look like it's clean or has low concentrations. A lot of people, a lot of agencies, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency allows long screens for monitoring wells. Canyon Uranium Mine has 1 monitoring well. I've seen places in the developing world that monitor their mines much better than we do. I mean, anybody who knows basic trigonometry knows to get a direction of a plane, like a groundwater table, you need 3 points to figure out what directions it's going. There's one at Canyon Uranium Mine, and it's more or less a production well for the mine water. They're applying for the same EIS that they used back in the 1980s before they hit the gusher in the perched aquifer. And the thing is, a lot of the agencies are slow to recognize groundwater concerns. They don't know the technical things. And the mine's consultants are really very convincing. And so I would advise skepticism on those issues. Any questions? Sorry to get on my soapbox here, but
Let's thank Dave for his presentation.